Hello and welcome back to my lair. Today we need to have a very serious conversation about some things that are terribly important. Film, horror, cinephilia, me. My love of horror isn't something that has always existed. It really started when I was around 7 or 8 years old and I saw my very first horror movie. Horror is a diverse and expanding genre that goes all the way back to the beginning of cinema. Maybe not in the way that we imagine horror now, but thrill and excitement has always been a staple of the medium. You may not like the blood and gore of a slasher flick, but you may find joy in the suspense of a psychological thriller or in the laughs of a funny scary like Scary Movie or Shaun of the Dead. Either way, everyone has their favorite scary movie or at least one that they deem memorable. For me, horror has been a comfort and a gateway into my cinephilia, or my obsession with film. For the past 18 years, this obsession has grown and led me to question a lot, not just about myself, but about cinema as a whole. In my exploration, I have learned to question everything and challenge what often goes unchallenged in the film industry. And today, I am urging you to do the same. By the end of this video, I hope you are able to enter my mind just a little bit to uncover the complexities of film, the anxieties of cinephilia, the attraction of horror, and the honest truth about horror noir. So, let's begin. The year was 2006, and I was around 8 years old. The jeans were low-rise, we all wore Bobby Jack t-shirts, and Hannah Montana first aired on TV and became my entire personality. Little did I know my life would change forever when my cousin would bring me a bootleg copy of a movie I had never heard of. Monster House. Monster House really served as a cautionary tale. It was a reminder that anything can happen to anybody at any moment, and that was proven when not even 15 minutes into the film, a kid gets eaten by this possessed house. There's the creepy old man, the spooky music, the house coming alive, coupled with the bad audio and the shaky camera from the bootleg DVD, and I had a truly memorable viewing experience. Also, it was set in the 80s, and that alone is enough to scare any child. Despite the trauma, I still go back and watch that film every October. Horror tends to have that effect. Despite seeing the brutality and the uncomfortable truth about others and ourselves, we can't help but go back for more. My personal example of this desire for the anxious happened when I was around 10 years old and I watched Scream for the first time. After years of being tortured by my cousins chasing me around with the ghost face mask, I finally bit the bullet and watched it when it came on TV. While Monster House had piqued my interest in horror, Scream awoke something in me that I had never experienced before. It felt like my first true taste of cinematic love. That also could have been the fact that Matthew Lillard was the villain and I had a huge crush on Shaggy as a kid, but either way, I was invested. Everything about the film really captured what I now believe to be the best parts of horror in a fun little 2-hour package. It's funny, it's relatable, there's a killer final girl, and a ridiculous villain. Or two. Through the eyes of Wes Craven, we are given the perfect intro to horror film. Sure, there are other more critically acclaimed films that are discussed in hoity-toity classrooms and in the failed podcast of Film Bros, but I do think it's rare for a film like Scream to stand the test of time in the way that it has. Many have often wondered what is the reason behind the success of Scream, and I think it all comes down to one simple statement. Scream is a fan letter to horror and not a love letter. See, unlike love letters, which are full of hard eyes, adoration, and blind trust, fan letters are more honest, less curated, and a lot more brazen. People in love tend to be afraid to speak the truth lest the object of their affection finds their feelings too overwhelming, but a fan has no such shame, and that can be felt and seen in Scream. Scream is great because it really subverted the horror genre. Throughout the film, there are moments when characters like Randy Meeks really break the barrier between the audience and what is happening in the film by calling out all the tropes of traditional horror and slashers.
Who's there? Who's there?
You should never say who's there. Don't you watch scary movies? It's a death wish.
Wait, they're all the same. Some stupid killer stalking some big-breasted girl who can't act, who's always running up the stairs when she should be going out the front door. It's insulting.
Number 3, never, ever, ever, under any circumstances say, I'll be right back. Because you won't be back.
I'm getting another beer. You want one?
Yeah, sure.
I'll be right back.
His character in particular is the perfect go-between for the audience because he is weird, not really a main character, and he's simple enough that you never really question if he's Ghostface, even when he's accused by his closest friends. As a great fan letter should be, Scream was like a call to arms for me. After watching it, I wanted to get that same feeling all over again and tenfold. I wanted to learn what all of the references were. Who's Freddy? Who's Michael? What's a Jason besides my cousin? I was asking the important questions, and after several trips to the library, a few Redbox rentals, and a lot of illegal sites later, I had amassed a library of horror knowledge that was useful for nobody except for myself. That was until now. Right now, I want to take you along with me on a journey of cinematic discovery. For the next little while, we'll take a trip through horror history to see where we started and where we are now. So, let's begin. Starting at the beginning, like the very beginning, like 1890s beginning with George Méliès. He created what is widely believed to be the first horror movie called The House of the Devil, and does have a French name, but I'm not even going to try and say it. The film was 3 minutes of pure Méliès. Skeletons, ghosts, bats that transform, and of course the devil. While the film was more fantastical and not really scary, it is about the supernatural, and that counts. Moving along to the 1920s, we reach the silent era of horror. It's around this time we finally start seeing some scary movies. This period was defined by the crazy performances and even crazier costuming and makeup. The true start of this era would probably be the 1920s film The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which was followed by Nosferatu and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Listen, if silent films and German expressionism are your thing, then this is the era for you. The next era would be the Golden Age, which lasted from the late 30s to the early 50s. Around this time is when we saw so many of our beloved monster movies came to be. There was Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Wolfman, and so many others. An interesting thing to note about this era is that films were under strict control of the Hays Code at this time, which really took a lot of the more problematic themes, or rather fun, out of films. Despite the restrictions, Universal Studios really excelled with the monster genres, while their counterparts focused on making musicals and gangster films. For the people that don't like big scares or a lot of violence, this is the era for you. Next stop is the horror renaissance, which might be one of the most famous film eras in general, even outside of horror. The 60s to the 70s were really that girl. The Hays Code was gone, so we can finally talk about the nitty-gritty stuff like religion, murder, guns, and so much more. Hitchcock was really popping off at the time with Psycho, The Birds, Peeping Tom. Then there was The Omen, one of my personal favorites, Carrie, Rosemary's Baby, Eyes Without a Face, which went on to inspire the genius that is The Skin I Live In, The Exorcist, and the list goes on. If you couldn't tell, the general themes for this time were religion and rebellion against what came before. This is the era for you if you're into creepy kids and slow burn. Next, we arrive to the time of Cyndi Lauper, Aquanet, and neon spandex. The 1980s, which might actually be the most famous horror era of all time. This time saw the rise of the slasher flick and arguably some of the most recognizable horror films like Friday the 13th, The Shining, Cujo, Pet Sematary, Child's Play, and of course Nightmare on Elm Street. If I were to pick one word that would describe this era, it would be camp. And I don't mean Crystal Lake. I mean camp as in Susan Sontag and her notes on camp, where she describes it as sensibility that revels in artifice, stylization, theatricalization, irony, and exaggeration rather than content. In simple terms, camp is playful, anti-serious, and over the top, which is a perfect way to describe the 1980s. If you're a fan of big hair, big effects, even bigger villains, and a lot of queer undertones, then this is the era for you. Moving on, before the Aquanet fumes get to our head, we approach the 1990s. I'm not even sure what you would call this era. I'm calling it the think piece era. Anyway, the defining characteristics of films during this time were the fact that there is less blood, less scares, but the audience was forced to think more. We got memorable films like Misery, Candyman, The Blair Witch Project, and Silence of the Lambs. As I mentioned before, these slow-paced thrillers really helped a film like Scream stand out at the time. Diverging. Up until this point, I have focused a lot on Western horror, but I must say in the 90s, Japan was giving the girls a run for their money. We had Ringu, which got an American remake. We had Dark Water, that got an American remake. Really, anything Hideo Nakata did in the 1990s got an American remake, but there was also Don't Look Up and Tomie, which if you haven't read any of Junji Ito's comics, I highly suggest that you do. Big themes that were popular then and still persist in Japanese horror are the haunted house, the destruction of the nuclear family, and scary women, specifically scary mothers. This is the era for you if you like suspense, emotional damage, and fava beans with a nice Chianti. As we approach the modern day, we have finally arrived in the 2000s, which has been called the Saw era. When Saw first came out, something really shifted in the horror atmosphere, but even before that, things were different. Post 9/11 America was built different. All of a sudden, nobody could be trusted, and horror saw this really intense obsession with torture. Films like Saw, Hostel, and others really caught the eye of bigger audiences, partly due to the low budget and graphic nature. There were some less gross and funnier movies that came out during this time too, like Scary Movie, a couple Scream sequels, and Final Destination. Not my favorite era, but I will say the 2000s did give us one of the most talked about and terrifying lines in horror history ever in The Strangers.
Why are you doing this to us?
Because you were home.
But this era did also give us Human Centipede, so do with that what you will. This is the era for you if you like being stressed, gore for the sake of gore, or if Hinge is your favorite dating app. You know who you are. Finally, we have made it to the end. Well, kinda. We've made it to the 2010s. Maybe I'm biased because these are the films that I got to see in theaters and really experience that first wave for, but I think these films are great. They don't call this the second horror renaissance for nothing. This era gave us Paranormal Activity, Cabin in the Woods, It Follows, As Above, So Below, and The Conjuring, among a myriad of others. Honestly, I could make a whole video just on this era. I could make a 5-part series just on As Above, So Below. Defining characteristics of this era are social commentary, unseen evil, and plot twist. This is the era for you if you have taste, period. Finally, we have arrived at the end of this little detour, but trust me, this information will come in handy later when I start discussing film theory. So, let's move on to the next topic, what I am calling... Before college, I watched films like most other people, for entertainment, for the thrill, to learn, to experience. My love of cinema was innocent. That wasn't until my sophomore year when we read a book on feminist film theory and my world was changed. All of a sudden, films that I used to love, I had to nitpick. All of the little details and gaps that I never noticed before turned into big chasms, and I just didn't know how to handle that information. You see, this is the stuff your film professors don't tell you. The process of uncovering your cinephilia is full of anxious moments. The more you learn about the world and about yourself, the worse you feel, especially as a woman, but even more so in my case as a black woman, but maybe that's just me. When studying feminist film theorists, I realized I had a long way to go before I could really call myself a lover or a scholar of film. There was Laura Mulvey, Barbara Creed, Julia Kristeva, Susan Sontag, Carol Clover, and my personal favorite, Bell Hooks. For me, Bell Hooks was really the catalyst that made me change the way that I view films. Her theory on the oppositional gaze is quite simple to understand, but that doesn't make it any less impactful. In short, the theory is a gesture of resistance, not only to the male gaze, but also towards the oppression of minorities through cinema by the all-inclusive woman. It's all about understanding that your reality is not the one that is curated on screen by people that are your opposite. Which leads me to my next point. An integral feature of horror is the woman. She is mother, daughter, lover, foe. Despite all the variations of women that we see physically on screen, especially in horror, it's still clear to me that women are often seen as nothing more than mere objects for the male gaze or for the spectator's gaze. Horror is such an interesting genre in the way that it perfectly reflects the times in which it was made. You can really tell which era a horror film came from just by observing the way that women are treated and portrayed. Are the girls being chased around in a psychological game of cat and mouse with a killer? Then you're probably in the 90s. Is she being tortured just because? You're probably in the 2000s. Is the innocent schoolgirl being preyed upon in the sanctity of her childhood bedroom? Then you're probably in the 80s. All of these behaviors and representations are so obvious once you start actually looking for them. In her book, The Monstrous Feminine, Barbara Creed does an incredible job of explaining woman in the context of horror. To make a long story short, the virgin lives to the end, the harlot does not, and if she's a female villain, then she's evil just because. But it also has to do with her reproductive system, because periods, birth, and mommies are scary. According to Barb's, women in horror are either one-dimensional victims created by the patriarchy, or if they're a baddie, then they probably fall into one of a few categories. The mother. Whether this be the archaic mother or the castrating mother, they're both overbearing and all-encompassing. Think your Norma Bates in Psycho, Alien, Kathy Bates in Misery, or Hereditary. Then there's the castrator, whether that be the woman who seeks revenge for an assault or a rape, like in Jennifer's Body or I Spit on Your Grave, or the castrator who has penis envy and looks to make men as weak as women. Think Teeth. There's witches, which is pretty self-explanatory, but the witch also usually represents the rejection of the traditional, and for men, that is scary spice. Think about Carrie or Castlevania. There's the vampire, which, once again, obvious, but the female vampire is different in that she is mother and lover to those that she turns, and for that reason alone, she is evil. Think Dracula, The Hunger, Castlevania. Sorry, I've been watching a lot of Castlevania recently, so it's on my mind. There's a lot of other archetypes that she talks about, like the possessed monster, think the exorcist, the haunting of X, the taking of Y, etc. There's the monstrous womb, the Electra, and a ton of other Freudian concepts, but you get the point. Women are either virgins or bad news bears, and that's simply not how the world works. I've seen a lot of horror films in my day, and it's so painfully obvious when a man has made a film catered to other men that have never known the touch of a real woman. But let's keep going. Arguably the most popular archetype for women in horror is the final girl. Our Sidney Prescotts, our Laurie Strodes, our Sally Hardestys, our Ripleys, the list goes on. The final girl is the symbol of the perfect girl in horror. She is active when in the clutches of her killer, but passive when she's with the men in her life. She's smart, but not too smart. According to Carol Clover, the woman that coined the term final girl, she is boyish, watchful, intelligent, and resourceful in a pinch. And most importantly, she's a virgin. The final girl is usually the only fully psychologically developed character in the film, which forces the audience to side with her. All the extras usually serve as cannon fodder until we finally get to the end with the big battle between our final girl and the villain. By developing the final girl, we, the audience, or rather the male audience, is forced to submit to the victimization of the woman and then rejoice at her triumph at the end, according to Laura Mulvey. Now, even though the male audience is being forced to inhabit the mind of woman, that does not mean that she is an equal or exempt from the pressures and influence of the male gaze. The layering eyes and the sexualization both on screen and in the audience is obvious. Rule number 1 of the final girl is that she has to be a woman that men want to be inside of, both mentally and, well, you get the idea. On the other hand, a trope that I don't think we talk about nearly enough is the anti-final girl. The AFG in many ways is a refreshing divergence from the typical final girl, and for that reason, I love her. The anti-final girl is strong and resilient. In many ways, she is a modern take on the gothic heroines of the 1940s. She's tormented by her personal demons, belittled by society, and gaslit by the people around her. The AFG is a survivalist who depends on being resourceful, but also being able to respond to change. The AFG will do anything to survive, even if that means momentarily siding with the villain. Examples of our anti-final girls are Jennifer Check from Jennifer's Body, but also maybe even Needy, Kirsty Cotton from Hellraiser, Cecilia Cass in The Invisible Man, Cassandra from Promising Young Woman, Thomason from The Vivitch, and Amanda Young from the Saw franchise. The anti-final girl motto is said perfectly in this clip from Jennifer's Body.
You're killing people. No, I'm killing boys. Boys are just placeholders. They come and they go.
And Jennifer was right. The films centered around AFGs often pit them against the morally gray men in their life. Unlike the villains in traditional horror who killed and attacked indiscriminately, the AFG's villain is a husband, a neighbor, a friend. Men who come from good families and had good intentions and whose dastardly deeds are usually explained away and protected by the people around them. They say, oh, that's just her husband. They're going through a rough patch. Oh, that's not really rape. You know, they're just college kids. They got a little bit too drunk. Oh, well, you know, that's his family. He just has to protect his family. And, well, really, I just think she's overreacting. You know, if she had never gone with him in the first place, then nothing would have happened to her.
Bombastic side eye.
Just like the AFG is gaslit by the people in her film, she is continued to be gaslit by the people in the audience as well. My dear sis cannot catch a break. It's a tragic situation for her, and unlike her final girl counterpart, she's not guaranteed a happy ending at the end of her film. The AFG is not a hero. She is a boy killer, and for that very reason alone, she rarely makes it to the end of her movie, let alone does she get a sequel. Since we're on a roll, let's keep it going with the enduring woman, who unsurprisingly goes forgotten when discussing women in horror. This term was first coined by Dr. Robin R. Means Coleman in her book Scream, Whitey Scream. While the final girl is always white and the anti-final girl is usually white but sometimes a person of color, the enduring woman is always black. Her blackness is an integral part of her identity, and her existence is terribly realistic. Dr. Means Coleman differentiates the final girl from the enduring woman based on their exposure to violence. For the white final girl, her exposure to violence ends when she defeats her villain. She can go back to the suburbs or back to college to focus on her healing journey. But the enduring woman is not afforded such luxuries. Dr. Coleman states that the black woman's triumphant walk into the sunset promises to take her not toward a life of peace, but back into the midst of rogue police, sexist men, and the man who is exploiting her black community. Taking this into account, we must also add in what Bell Hooks has to say on the topic. In her essay on the oppositional gaze, Bell Hooks encourages black women to not try and identify ourselves with the ideal ego or the passive female role that Laura Mulvey describes. We are simply built different as black women, and their image of the all-inclusive woman is not a one-size-fits-all for us. Examples of enduring women are Vicaria and the angry black girl and her monster, Gail Bishop and Master, Cherie and Run Sweetheart Run, and Pam Grier and Scream Blackula Scream. It's amazing that we can't even catch a break in the world of fantasy. But this conversation leads me to my next point. First, let's set the record straight that black people in horror is nothing new. We have always been there, just mainly in the background for the beginning. But right now I want to talk about horror noir, or black horror. For the past 70 years, black horror has been evolving into what we know it as now. From the first horror film to star a black character as a lead in the 1968 film Night of the Living Dead, to a black director winning an Academy Award for an unapologetically black horror film. In this relatively short period of time, so much has changed, but there's still so much that has stayed the same. When we have this discussion about black horror, it's important to remember that black horror is black history. Our culture and our struggles are deeply embedded in the films that we make for us and about us, and horror is no exception to that rule. Horror is an innately political genre that preys on the social anxieties at the time, and when you look back at films from the blaxploitation era of the 70s and compare them to now, it might shock you how similar some of the conversations are. I think a film that really captures the essence of black horror is Candyman. Released in 1992 at the end of the slasher era and at the beginning of the procedural horror era, Candyman was different. It was the first time a black man had played the role of a main villain in a horror film, and even better, he didn't fall into one of the cliche archetypes for black characters. Candyman is a perfect combination of history style with a twist of urban legend. Also, it was one of the first films that openly talked about segregation and racism as a horror on its own. Not only that, the film really changed the game when it came to the types of characters that black men could play. Candyman rejected the typical black stereotypes and became a more nuanced symbol for black trauma. Candyman was perfectly honest. I say this because there's a lot of new films coming out that are honest to a fault. I need directors, writers, producers, everyone to understand that truth does not always need to be brutal. There is a way to depict and showcase the black experience without being traumatizing. Going from PWI to PWI to PWI, from the time I entered school all the way through college, I never really paid that much attention to the fact that characters looked like me often were missing or mistreated in films, especially horror, until I got older. There was always the running joke that the black guy dies first, but it never really hit me how true that was until I started watching films critically. And the incredible book, The Black Guy Dies First, also written by Dr. Means Coleman, along with Mark Harris, there is a chapter titled The Other Through the Eyes of Others, which examines the way Black people are treated as one-dimensional characters on screen. As you watch horror films going all the way back to the beginning when Black characters were first introduced on the big screen, the feeling of otherness is palpable. Black people are put there as a sign of diversity, but is it really diverse when there's no one behind the camera that looks like us? And trust me, when there's not, we can tell. Going back to the book, some well-known archetypes that they discuss in this chapter are the spook, aka why is this man in hysterics? This type was very popular in the 30s and 40s, a little less so today, unless you're into Tyler Perry movies, but that's a conversation for another day. Then there's the witch doctor, who's usually from Africa, Louisiana, the Caribbean, somewhere exotic, and he's really only there to give you the heebie-jeebies. Then there's the magical Negro, who is selfless and really only there to help the white protagonist on their journey of self-discovery. Think about Whoopi Goldberg and Ghost, Tony Todd in Final Destination, Michael Clark Duncan and The Green Mile. The list goes on. There actually is a film coming out next year called The American Society of Magical Negroes, starring David Allen Greer and Justice Smith, which I am thoroughly looking forward to. And then there's the sacrificial Negro, aka Mr. I'll stay behind, Mr. I have to go and save them. Think Dick Halloran in The Shining, Idris Elba in Pacific Rim, Lil Rel in Bird Box, the list goes on. Moving along, there are other archetypes like the seductress, the gangsta, the authority figure, who's usually a cop. There's the voice of reason, the sidekick, the rapper. Not that they rap in the movie, it's just in the 90s and 2000s, they loved putting rappers in horror movies, whether or not they could act. And last but not least, the black guy. The infamous black guy who does not really need to be a guy at all. The black guy can be a woman. They just need to be a black character in an ensemble cast who is nameless, unimportant, and gone before you know it. I think it's in response to these outdated archetypes along with our current political climate that a new subgenre of horror emerged, colloquially termed woke horror, which... let's not get it twisted. Black horror has always been woke, at least a little bit. This is not a new thing. But I do think that this subgenre was popularized by Jordan Peele's film Get Out, and it was swiftly followed by films and shows like Us, Them, Antebellum, Lovecraft Country, Candyman, the 2021 requel, His House, Bad Hair, The Blackening, which we need to talk about that title, and the list goes on. The subgenre itself has proven to be quite divisive amongst the community, with some people saying that films are escapist entertainment and shouldn't be about the real world, especially not horror, and then the other camp is saying that they find these films refreshing and impactful because for the first time we have black directors telling honest but approachable black stories. I'm of the camp that a film can be political but also entertaining. I'm looking at you, Hunger Games, Divergent, The Maze Runner, and nobody ever said anything about those films. Black horror and black films are constantly evolving based on the mindset of the people. Despite the never-ending evolution, there's always a focus on black struggle in film, which is fine. I mean, it's fine. I don't mind seeing real problems depicted on the screen because it reminds me that my existence does not need to be a lonely one. However, I would not mind a quirky and cute black rom-com where race is a non-factor, like in fan fiction. Being black, studying films, and loving films has been complicated, but in many ways rewarding. The longer I live and experience, the more faces I see like mine, both in the academic setting and on the big screen. Anyways, we have finally reached the end of our journey. Thank you for tagging along with me as I rant and rave about this genre that I love so much. But at the end of it all, I can't help but wonder if I really am even a cinephile. I know I've been calling myself that throughout this entire video, but it wasn't until now that the weight of that word started to hit me. You see, cinephile is just so serious, so prestigious, so French. You think cinephile and you think names like Jean-Luc Godard, Tarantino, Scorsese, people who take their craft seriously. And do I really want to be associated with names like that? I don't know. Maybe I'm merely an fan or an academic fan of a few very specific, often considered lowbrow genres like horror, anime, comic books, 90s rom-coms. I mean, I'll be the first to die on the hill that 10 Things I Hate About You is the greatest film to have ever been made. I'm sorry to whatever Christopher Nolan, David Fincher, art house think piece new wave film you believe to be number one. Nobody is topping Heath Ledger and Julia Stiles in the 90s. I'm sorry. But back to the point. Maybe I'm an Agavan in the middle of her cinephilic experience. Anyway, the more I learn and read and understand, the more I think that maybe I don't want to be a cinephile. It's too much pressure, anxiety, and the company can be a little boring. Being a fan is fun, exciting, and liberating. I don't know, maybe after you watch this, you'll say, oh, she's definitely a cinephile, or no, I think she's just a fan. But me, I'm not so sure. My journey from watching my first horror film all the way up until now has definitely had its ups and downs. The beginning was really fun and exciting, but the more I learned, the more upset I became. All of the things my innocence hid from me slowly became uncovered, and cinema no longer felt like an escape from reality. It felt like a trap. Even genres as outlandish as horror and teen dystopian rom-coms suddenly felt a little too real. But despite that, or rather, in spite of that, I find myself going back for more. I'm learning to find joy in that anxiety, in the deeper analysis, and in the overall experience of cinema and cinephilia, if that's what you want to call it. And hopefully, after watching this video, you are able to expand your genre horizons and find joy in these things too. But thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next time.